This Quoircast Podcast episode is brought to you by the Messy Spirituality Podcast. Hey, this is Jason Elam. Join Lola Robbins, Kyle Butler, and me for the Messy Spirituality Podcast, where we try to empower your spiritual evolution with honest conversation about how to be a better human, taking a critical look at toxic Bible stories, and look behind the headlines for growth opportunities underlying current events. Hey, it's a bisexual hairstylist who escaped a cult, a black mystic, and a recovering Southern Baptist preacher. What could possibly go wrong? Check out the Messy Spirituality Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts.
Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney.
Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. My name is Nat Turney. I'm with my brother, as always, John Turney. Say hi, John.
Hi, John.
There he is. He's nestled up there in the mountains of Northern California, currently sipping what I hope is bourbon, but who knows? Could be any sort of. He's got a mouthful. He's just nodding at me.
Actually, it's a single malt. Sorry.
Oh wow, fancy. I have to just drink my water here. But we're back with the podcast. This is Not Church. We have unchurchy conversations about church with all kinds of interesting people, and today is no different. Today we welcome to the program Kelley Nikondeha. She has written an amazing book. She just gave me the nod of approval that I might have gotten close to pronouncing her name, so I'm going to go with that. So this book, which will be released actually by the time this podcast is available, this book will be available. I believe it comes out October 4th, and this is called "The First Advent in Palestine." And so, if I can zoom in on the subtitle: "Reversals, Resistance, and the Ongoing Complexity of Hope." So let me read you a really quick bio, and then we're just going to jump headlong into a conversation with Kelley. Kelley Nikondeha is a writer, liberation theologian, and community development practitioner. She combines biblical texts in various cultural contexts to discover insights for embodied justice, community engagement, and living faith. She is the author of Defiant, What the Women of Exodus Teach Us About Freedom, and adopted the Sacrament of Belonging in a Fractured World, and is known for highlighting Palestinian voices and rights. She travels between the Southwest US and Burundi in East Africa. And now that I've stumbled my way all the way through that, welcome to the podcast, Kelley. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you. Glad to see you both and be here in conversation with you.
We're glad you're here. If you don't mind, our typical sort of jumping off question for folks is that they kind of give us a background in their faith journey, kind of what kind of stuff they've gone through. If that's good for you.
Sure. Well, I am a California girl, born and raised in Orange County, so the kind of the heart of Southern California. I was born into the Catholic Church, and maybe when we hit my junior high years, my parents made their exodus from Catholicism into evangelicalism. And so I spent many, many years, I'd say all the way into my early adulthood, in evangelical spaces, and then dipped into some pretty heavy charismatic spaces with the Vineyard, right about the time that the Vineyard blessing up in Toronto or the Toronto blessing was happening up in Canada. So that is part of my experience. But in the last set of years, I've returned to my mother church, which is a phrase that was gifted to us by Phyllis Tickle. And the moment she said it, it explained my coming home to the Catholic Church. And so I would say now, in terms of just religious identity, I'm back with my Catholic brothers and sisters. Although I'm ecclesiastically promiscuous. I have worked in Methodist spaces and love the connectionality of the Methodist Church. And I still have, I'm still kind of evangelical adjacent, even though I'm not part of that tribe. I still understand and have many deep friendships in that space. But I feel comfortable, talking about faith with my friends all over the spectrum. But I have Jewish friends and Messianic friends and Muslim friends, and I love being in conversation with them as well. So my journey is that's a snapshot anyways.
Yeah, for sure. I while you were talking, I wrote down in my notes on my phone, ecclesiastically promiscuous. Because I love that phrase. And I think that describes me to a T. I love that. We might call that ecumenical, but I like your, I like your phrase better. I like that better. And because I don't know about John, John's journey has been a little bit disjointed and different. So he took a large chunk of, he took decades off from the church. My dalliance with ecumenicalism actually began when I was working for a very, very evangelical pastor who insisted that I go on a spiritual retreat called the Walk to Emmaus. And it was, so it is not like this everywhere. Just like everything else, there's variations of this, but in the community where we live in Texas, it's a very ecumenical group of people. The Methodist Church sort of owns and runs that program, but it's held at a Catholic retreat center. It's attended by Catholics and Protestants alike from every conceivable stripe. And so because of that, it has to be very, very aware of other faith traditions and walk a little gently. So it was interesting that his insistence that I do this was my exit out of that world of his. Because I was like, wait a minute, this whole Christian experience is wider than I thought and deeper than I thought. And there's all kinds of stuff that I'd been told was not correct or whatever. And I anyway, so it was his undoing to send me on this retreat. So ecclesiastically promiscuous is where I think that describes me to a T. In your bio, it says that you split time then between the Southwest U.S., like I guess Arizona and Burundi. How that sounds like an interesting story. How does that come about?
I have been connected to Burundi through marriage to my husband, who was born and raised in Burundi. Grew up in what we would call extreme poverty, the less than $1 a day. That we used to always use that description. But my husband grew up in that kind of poverty. And when we met in the States, we had a 4-year friendship. And at some point, it's like, well, gee whiz, you're not with anybody and I'm not with anybody. And we kind of are heading the same direction in life, we thought. So we ended up getting married. So now I am, I live in between both places. And then we adopted 2 Burundian babies who are both now almost 19.
Wow. Okay.
So my family really, I'm an only child, so it's me and my parents. But the largest part of my family, all the aunts and uncles and the ones that are in the city and the ones that are up country and the ones I find a new branch every time I go back, they're all Burundians. And so that is my connection to East Africa.
That is awesome. So let me ask you this then, maybe, and I hope it's not too pedantic of a question, but then how does that connection to that part of the world then inform your scholarship, or how does it kind of lead you down? Does it? I guess I shouldn't assume that it does. I assume it does, but. Well,
it has shaped me as the person, right, who would then be, the learner and changed my perspective. As I said, I grew up in Southern California. I grew up in a pretty affluent family, a white Christian family. And I saw the world in a very specific way. And it was in marriage to my husband that we couldn't assume anything, right, about our families being the same or our church experience be the same or our understanding of government or citizenship. We couldn't assume that any of that. So we had to talk through everything. But in the process, it was the greatest lesson for me about how different countries work, how different communities work. I mean, obviously, I started to recognize I started to see some of the systemic racism in my own country as my husband would experience it here and name it so that I could see and understand it. I started to see the difference between a very individualistic society and his being so deeply communal. His country was just coming out of 3 or 4 decades of civil war when we first moved there. And being part of a society that was coming out of civil war and seeing what it is to be a survival society the ways in which that the trauma, the very recent trauma, shaped the culture. And these things just started to reshape and was probably a huge part of how I ended up becoming more of a liberation theologian, is recognizing that salvation had to be more than just souls. It had to be more than just that. It had to be more inclusive. It had to be good news to the people around me. And good news actually did have to do with indebtedness and land and safety and food security. And so, yes, my connection to East Africa and my husband has been such a great translator of culture and such a gift to me. Yeah, absolutely has changed the way that I see and understand the world and the text.
Yeah. So when you go to write this book about the first Advent, and you obviously you're looking at this from a Palestinian perspective, then does some of that history of Burundi being, how'd you say it, a trauma culture? Do you see parallels then between that and, say, the Jewish people, who I see in very similar ways, having dealt with multiple traumas through their history, and at the time of the first Advent, still very much feeling the scars of even the Babylonian exile, and having obviously living still under Roman occupation and all of these other things that sort of disenfranchised them?
Well, you have just summarized the first chapter.
Oh, hey.
Hey,
look at that.
Intuited where I was going with this. Yes, I think that was one of the first surprises as I really started to lean into the Advent texts, which were given to us by Luke and Matthew, is the presence of trauma. And of course, now that more people are doing trauma-informed theology and exegesis, it's like I started to see, there was trauma in the text. And when I went all the way back to Maccabees, of course, I love Isaiah. And so the Babylonian exile and the Lamentations as the grief work of the Hebrew Bible. And this is stuff that I already has deeply shaped my theology. But seeing it in the intertestamental period with the Maccabees and seeing that as kind of the predicate to the first Advent, and recognizing that in the very bodies of Jesus's human ancestors would be generational trauma, but also very recent trauma, because of course we're going to, in pretty quick order, see the trauma that surrounded Mary and Joseph and Zachariah and Elizabeth, and that Jesus as an infant would experience and have in his human body. And so in the body of God, we have this deep awareness of an experience of trauma, which really changed my understanding of incarnation. But in any event, yes, that, and then I have, as I said, Palestinian friends in particular who you can't be with them in the region and not see and hear the echoes of trauma that they experience daily. And so I think the combination of what was happening in the text, but what was happening with my friends in the West Bank, it was inevitable, I think, that I would finally see those layers of trauma and how that impinged on the Advent stories and on our understanding of incarnation.
Well, and then, in Western culture, the Advent has been romanticized and nostalgized. Can you say that? Is that a word? But, we have this picture of Advent as, I think, something utterly, completely different than it really was, because we've just incorporated it into our mythologies. So when you talk about incarnation, I'm flipping through your page on Amazon, and we don't like to give Amazon too many props, but let's face it, that's how people buy books a lot of the time. So, but I'm flipping through some of the endorsements, and obviously besides the amazing, there was one by Peter Heltzel that I don't recognize the name, but I don't know if there's any higher praise than he gives you on this. Then he says, after On the Incarnation by Athanasius, The First Advent in Palestine by Kelley Nikondeha is the best book I've read on the Incarnation, Peace, and Hope. Holy mackerel! I mean,
I was
in the same breath as Athanasius, or as my friends would say, Athanasius. That's Because the first place where I got any real, and my first introduction to on the incarnation was through Dr. Baxter Kruger, who referenced it a great deal in one of his books. So of course I had to run out and grab it and buy it. And being raised pretty much Western evangelical my whole life, we don't talk about the church fathers. For us, the church history begins at the Reformation, and we give a passing nod to some of the ancients. But so after reading on the incarnation and after hearing you just explain what you were talking about with trauma, it reminds me of that part of Athanasius that says, anyway, those things that aren't fully experienced by God can't be healed. And
exactly.
It's not the right word to use. The quote is different. Mm-hmm. But so much of our understanding of incarnation, I think, is a superficial understanding of, okay, well, God became human. Okay, but what does that mean to fully become human? And that which is not assumed cannot be healed. So when God assumes human flesh, even to the point of assuming the generational trauma that you spoke of, even to the point of being born into a family that was already dysfunctional in a way simply because of the generations of trauma they'd experienced and that they would inevitably pass on to their son, that to me is a much more compelling story than born in a barn surrounded by, cute animals.
Right.
Right.
Well, and that now resides in the eternal body of God.
Right.
This deep that experience that Jesus lived now is part of that eternal body or memory of God. And I'm utterly convinced that the God who has experienced that trauma and experienced some of the other things we're going to hear about, the economic exploitation, the stigma, the shame, that the God who has experienced that is the God who will know how to heal it and will be committed to healing it, even though it is not on a timetable. But I finished this work and felt greatly confident that there is no way that the God who has that in God's self would ever then not know how to bring it to culmination, even though I may not ever see it.
Well, then even the very instrument of his wounding will be the thing which heals, which I love that circuit, that the way that comes around. Athanasius points that out in a couple different places, but so all of that is not lost. It actually becomes the vehicle by which, healing comes, and through whatever salvation means, it comes through that suffering. I'm not sure if you're aware of Mercy Aiken. Do you know Mercy at all?
No, I don't.
You guys connected. Okay. So Mercy she's an amazing woman, but she splits time between Bethlehem and the States and has done a lot of work with Palestinian Christians and Muslims and Jews, but trying to walk those spaces. But she actually co-wrote a book about Advent in Bethlehem, and I'm looking for it right now, trying to find the name of the book. Oh, it's called Yet in the Dark Streets Shining, a Palestinian Story of Hope and Resilience in Bethlehem. And I feel like you guys would find some pretty cool common ground.
Probably. I was hoping to write this book. I was supposed to spend 3 months in Bethlehem. Yeah. And I was going to write the bulk of this book from a very specific little inn on the top of Star Street, and then COVID hit. Yeah. And it was one of those things that, as much as I love this book, there's a part of me that feels like there's this ache for that part that would have only come from writing it in that actual space that I'll just never fully know.
or you'll write an updated version and include a chapter from, I don't know. That's what happened to Mercy as well. She actually kind of ended up coming back to the States for longer than she intended to because of COVID. She couldn't get back, but she's working with some people there in Bethlehem, and I don't know. I just immediately thought that you guys would probably really hit it off and have some common ground. But anyway, that's an aside.
I just want to back up a little bit and talk about this acknowledgement of the Apocrypha that a lot of us within the Western Evangelical Church, first of all, maybe don't even know, right? That don't even know it exists. I didn't, to be fully honest, the first 18, 20 years of my existence didn't even know it existed. And if I did have any inclination of it, it was, it's the Catholics have that, and we know what we think about the Catholics, right? So it can't be holy writings. It can't be any of that. But I like how you acknowledge this 400-year gap that, like, my Bible has, right? This 400 years of silence that the Maccabees and the other books within the Apocrypha talk about. And it brings a whole nother level of trauma, right? And a whole nother level of exile and redemption. But then this redemption is very short-lived. And it's just this idea of this generational trauma. And I think the Western Evangelical Church, and Nat can correct me or either one of you can correct me if you think I'm wrong on this, but we only want to talk about the Advent around Christmas, right? So the church does this really weird balancing act. They don't go through the history towards the Advent. They bounce around, right? And so it's never this, we go from this book to this book within like an order that shows this trauma into the Advent. We would rather just forget all this and just jump into the Advent for our Christmas season. And then
I'll do you one better, John. I'll push back only in this and say that in the Western Evangelical churches I grew up in, I never heard the word Advent.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Unless it was related to a calendar. And so as a kid, I thought Advent was a kind of chocolate that you got out of it. And it was usually bad, stale, just
right.
Cool. I mean, some of that Advent chocolate, man. Oh, I don't like that stuff. I prefer dark chocolate. So that a church would even have, and our more mainline Protestant denominations obviously do. But that was one of the things that when I planted a church about 3 years ago now. And one of the things that we did, because September we planted, by November, we're doing this Advent thing. We're not going to jump straight into Christmas without these weeks of expectation and this anticipation that comes along with all of that. And rather than getting sucked up into the commercialization of Christmas, we want to actually go through the process, of going through the week, the week of peace and hope and love and joy, that is leading up to Christmas Day. And then obviously we're so Protestant, John, we didn't even know what the 12 days of Christmas were, man.
Well, right. Yeah.
Because as far as I was concerned, Christmas ended on December 26th. It was over. And there was all these other, so within, more Orthodox forms of Christianity, there's this other stuff going on. And so, yeah, John's right. We didn't, I got into I won't say an argument, but a conversation with my son and his wife this weekend. And there were certain things that they were pushing back on. And one of the, silly things like, I won't go to a Catholic church because they just have these big crucifixes on the, and I think that's weird. I think it's weird to not talk about the crucifixion. I'm pretty sure that Paul said he resolved to only preach Christ and him crucified. So to take away that image of a crucified God seems to be a whitewashing of our history. But
right. Well, we certainly want to remove, at least I have found in evangelical spaces, there was a sanitation.
Yeah,
right?
For sure.
So we don't want to talk about somebody who was killed as a terrorist and the mechanism of the death. We don't want to talk about the politics and the economics and all that stuff.
No.
We don't want, and especially like you said, we come into Advent and there's an expectation that it's going to be a magical, hope-filled time, that there's going to be anticipation and twinkle lights and pumpkin spice things, and that so is not what we get from Luke and Matthew. And of course, as I said, Maccabees, which brings us from the intertestamental period, which was loud with suffering. I mean, the only person who had the prerogative to be silent in those 400 years was God, because everybody else was roiled in battles and loss and land confiscation and we're under economic duress. I mean, nobody else was quiet. And so it was loud with loss and lament. And then, as I said, that's the predicate for what we're going to find with the Holy Family and that story. But it's critical. I think, Luke and Matthew wanted us to see these things. They would have expected that we would have understood this world when God decided to arrive, like feet on the ground in the middle of, the Pax Romana.
Ooh.
Gee, if there was already world peace, why was that the time that God decided to set foot on the earth? I think that, that was another fascinating exploration, is why then? Caesar was already the savior of the world. That's what they were calling him.
Right. And having talked to Dom Crossan, like we spoke about earlier, when in his book, he goes into great depth, right, about this the illusion of the Pax Romana, and how it was already crumbling at the time that Jesus shows up, but they were still clinging to this hope that this peace could endure, even at the tip of a sword, or always at the tip of a sword.
Always.
And so I like that he brings that contrast into the peace that Christ offers, and that the peace that Caesar wants to thrust upon the world, versus this peace that actually comes from economic and political justice. So yeah, there's when we get into the story of Jesus in the Western, again, I critique my own tradition because I feel like I have the most right to critique my own tradition. That's been my experience is we've reduced what happens to Jesus on the cross to a sacrificial act that had to be done. Praise God, it had to happen that way. So then we can sanitize the pure evil of it, which was the collaboration of church and state to sponsor the execution of a terrorist or someone they needed to get rid of. And so I think for too many people, that just hits a little too close to home sometimes with what we see in our own world. We'd rather not frame it in those terms, right? It's a little easier in the abstract to say, well, no, this had to happen this way so that Jesus could be the sacrifice we needed him to be. But in this Advent story, then, so we go from this place of trauma. And so out of this, Jesus's family is formed in the midst of all of this. Where does that lead us then as the story sort of unfolds? As
I said, we start with, I think, an understanding of trauma. And I'm so grateful actually for our Catholic brothers and sisters that have preserved the Apocrypha that's how I found it. It was in the Jerusalem Bible that my mom had. She may have left Catholicism, but she still had the old Bible on the shelf, and that's where I first found it.
Like, what are these books?
I was so grateful that there were some breadcrumbs there, and this is where the beauty of a ecumenical understanding of church, where we are. Anyways, that was saved for us so that we could find it. But that trauma is going to affect politics and military action and economic exploitation, and all of those forces are felt in these Advent narratives. Of course, we're going to hear from Matthew. We're going to hear from Luke that it was a Caesar census, right? You had to go and register for the census. And it was said, I think 3 or 4 times in a matter of verses, register for the census, and I think I always heard that as, like going to the DMV and updating your, driver's license address. Like it was some kind of benign thing you had to do as a member of this society. And I had completely missed until I came back and started exploring more deeply that, oh, no. The only time that Caesar would have had this kind of a movement, and of course, historically, we didn't necessarily have a census at this time. But what the world that Luke was giving us was that this kind of a census ordered by the emperor would have only been to serve one function, which was to up the taxes, to increase. They wanted to know how much can we extract? How much more can we extract? And so Joseph and Mary having to travel down for a census was nothing but bad news. Not only was it inconvenient timing for her, given her pregnancy, but, it also was, we know that at the end of this, we're all going to end up paying more taxes, and we're already heavily taxed. We're already struggling to save our land and to not fall into indentured, situations and losing our freedoms. And we're already dealing with food insecurity and all these other things. And it was about to get worse. And I think that we missed that there was a huge economic backdrop to Luke's telling in particular. That was something that I think also got my attention was, wow, we don't talk about the economics of Advent very often, at least not in any way that I think is congruent with what Luke was trying to show us.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Well, it doesn't really, it connects and it doesn't really connect. But I'd like your take on this. So specifically within the Western Evangelical Church, specifically within American church, I can't speak for other countries because I don't live there, but I can speak specifically for the American evangelical church. I can see where we don't want to talk about this in this way, because if we then want to admit that we see this, what the Roman Empire is doing to not only the Jews, but the Palestinians in this area, right? Then we have to acknowledge what we have done in our own country towards marginalized people. And so if we can ignore this trauma that happens within the Jewish people as they're moving towards Advent, towards this Messiah, and that we end up, for all intents and purposes, assassinating, right? But then we'd have to acknowledge what we did to the indigenous people of this country. We'd have to acknowledge what we did to the Africans that we brought to this country. We'd have to acknowledge what we did to basically the BIPOC community, right? So the Black, indigenous people of color. And we don't want to acknowledge that.
That's painful.
So we whitewash all of this into what we make now as this happy ending Christmas story of this child that's born in a manger, and he is the savior of the world through experiences that he's out of control of. This horrible empire kills him with the help of the Jewish people, and then we can blame them, and we can blame everyone around them, right? But we don't have to acknowledge all the suffering and trauma we have done.
The ways in which we're complicit, even in things like the economic structure,
yes.
I benefit from I'm one of the ones who benefits from the economy being set up the way that it is. And to the degree that I almost don't even think about it, and yet this text critiques, the economics that benefit the few, but cause much duress and pain and loss for the many. And if you really listen to the economic markers, you think, wow, there would have to be a completely different way of understanding my participation in the economics of my world, to center the vulnerable, like Joseph did. I mean, according to Matthew, Joseph had some money coming back to him. He had some not only to regain his reputation, but he had some money coming back to him when there was assumption that Mary might have committed adultery, right? And so he was, he was up at night. What am I going to do? I want to put her away quietly. He's a good, but we miss that by putting her away quietly, he was basically forgoing the public square where he could have cleared his name and got the financial, money back, got his money back. And he was willing to center the most vulnerable person in the story, which would have been Mary, and was willing to forego all of the other stuff, the economics that were rightly his, to center and protect her. Well, I just don't see a lot of people practicing their economics that way these days.
No, that's for sure.
If it's legally mine, I want it,
Yeah, it's my right. I'm entitled to it, right?
Right. It's the same as I like to talk about the Jubilee texts.
Well, no.
The idea that it would be good news for the poor, but hard news for the rest of us. No, I don't want to talk about that.
See how pissed off we get just about talking about forgiving a little bit of student debt, and,
right?
We forget.
Could we go as far? Could we go as far as to say that Jesus would be raised in this community that knows this story? This isn't a story that would be hidden, right? That some people are going to think that he's an illegitimate son of somebody, right? Who's, according to some people, would be no one has claimed to be the father. We know Joseph's not the father, so he sees what his adopted father did, and how does this not affect the way he creates his? I don't want to say theology, but his basis of community and how he reaches out to certain people, right? Because we see this time and time again where Jesus reaches out to very specific marginalized people. He pulls them into the gospel on purpose, as opposed to just reaching out to the status quo, which would be super easy to do, right? So, I mean, is it too far to say that this is, watching what his father did would be something that controlled and created this idea of how to be a better Jew? I don't know what else to say. Right. Better
But he
religious.
He learned from his adopted father.
Yeah.
That would be right. He learned something about belonging, and that family and connection was who you chose to be your family, not just your bloodline. Or in his case, right, questionable bloodlines. I mean, we see in the Gospels where he was sometimes called Mary's son. Well, that was a slight. That was a way to say, we don't know who your daddy is. Nobody really knows for sure.
Right.
You come from Galilee. There's a lot of half-breeds up there. A lot of
True.
up there. Like, we do not know. Like, and there are a lot of thoughts that actually Joseph died when Jesus was young. And so, raised by a single mom, and lots of questions swirling around his paternity. And so he would have grown up with that stigma. Plus, just being, from the Galilee with a Galilean accent would not have, endeared to a lot, to all the good people. So here he was, somebody who suffered stigma and so knew how to create a space for people to belong and be accepted because he knew what it was to not be.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and it's interesting to me too, then, because it's as, to me, it's as important the things that Jesus is said to have done as it is what the gospel writers decided to include. What still blows my mind is how we miss how liberation theology seems for some to be fringe. I don't understand that. I will never understand that. How is the gospel anything other than liberation? And specifically, as John mentioned, I mean, Jesus going to very specifically marginalized groups and saying, okay, I know that women have been treated this way, but we won't do this. That we see that the lepers can stand in for anybody we've deemed unclean. And we can say, no, we don't have those lines of demarcation anymore, right? That the Ethiopian eunuch can stand in for anybody who does not fall in line with mainstream gender identities or sexual identities and say, no, you're not excluded from this anymore. And so how we can read all of that liberation text out, or liberation theology out of the text, is an exercise in missing the point that I don't know is matched maybe anywhere else. It's just lunacy, I think.
Yeah. And that's where I'm really grateful to my husband and pulling me into a completely different space where I was allowed to, I remember when he and I were studying Jubilee texts together. He's a community development practitioner. So he's the guy who's out there doing it. What does Jubilee look like? So he's actually, we have a bank in Burundi with over 50,000 members. And the idea is for it to be an inroad for people who normally don't get in to the economy. And so he's thinking, how do I enact Jubilee? What does that look like as a banker, credentialed by the central bank in his country? And I'm digging into the text, and that's been another thing that's provided some interesting tension for us, because sometimes you can't do a one-to-one. You can forgive a debt according to Jubilee in the text, but if he were to wipe out the debts, he would have some problems with the central bank. And so so what is the deeper meaning of Jubilee? How do we press in? I remember him telling me, if this Jubilee text that then Jesus talks about in Luke 4 and says it's going to happen today, he's like, man, if Jesus would have said that here in Bujumbura, the capital city, my dad, and all of his friends who were the poorest of the poor, that would have been the best news possible. Somebody saying that your debts are going to be wiped out. He goes, there's no better news for poor people than all the debts that all of them had were going to be wiped out. And he says, that's what you in America don't get, is how radical it was for Jesus to say that, and how it would have been the best news possible for, people in my country who, lived on less than $1 a day and had lots of indebtedness. And so it started me on this trajectory of what eventually, would take me into liberation theology, because, wow, of course, debt relief and security and access to food. Of course, this was part of what God wanted us to have, not only a soul in heaven, but a life on earth that was, not just viable, but vibrant,
Right. And then bodily autonomy in the middle of all of that, right? So the right to sort of determine your own future. And I mean, a lot of those things, I think you're right. And for so many of us in the West, one of the things that you just said a few minutes ago struck me is when it comes to economics, I don't even really think, you said you don't really think about that very often. And that to me is always sort of the hallmark of whatever privilege we have, right? I don't have to spend nights wondering. I know where my privilege lies. I think being aware of privilege is as important as anything. So I talk to my friends who are LGBTQ or, in that world, and, they will say to me, well, you have the privilege to think about these topics or not. I don't have that privilege. I have to think about this every waking hour of the day because this is my life. And this is so the things that I can decide one day to really key in on those issues, and I can talk about them heavily, and then I can step away and talk about something else for a while. And so that notion of economic security for many of us in the States is just not that we don't have economic insecurity, but I just think it's different. I'm not sure that we've experienced the sort of abject poverty that people in certain parts of the world have.
Well, where survival is the first thing.
Right, right.
I think when we talk about vocation and what we want, it's like, well, first I want to survive.
Yeah.
Let's first talk about how we are all going to survive physically, and then we'll talk about some of these other choices.
That is kind of an interesting take back to the title of your book, The First Advent in Palestine, right? So there's, again, within the Western Evangelical Church, there's this whole idea that there's only one cultural group within this space, right? And that is the Jewish people, which isn't true. So how does the Advent fit into liberation theology or anything like that when it comes to people who don't fit into that narrow, very specific group of the Jewish faith? Because there's all these other people around there, and this Advent or this coming of this Messiah has to affect them too, even though they aren't part of what they would be considered, the true faith, right? And how does that mold?
Right. So, I think what we see with the Maccabees is we saw the Jewish suffering, which most evangelical Christians and a lot of the Christian church in the West totally is blind to. Jewish suffering even. We know about the Holocaust, but we don't even see in the text that Jewish suffering predated what happened in Germany, right? And for me, there was a moment where I realized, there are other people in the land. I had grown up hearing about trips to the Holy Land and going to be with the Jewish people. And we had Messianic Jews come and give their testimonies, how they found Jesus. But I had never heard about Palestinian people until I think it was the first Intifada. So 87, we started to see more on the news about something in the Middle East. And so I picked up a book by Thomas Friedman, from Beirut to Jerusalem. And I'm like, oh, good. I'm going to read this one book and I'll know everything I need to know about the Middle East. I've been reading for 30 years since.
Yeah. You're still getting there, right?
But it was the first time that I had actually realized there were other people in that land that had deep historical connection also. And of course, now I know it's even more complex. You have, refugees from other countries. You have the Bedouins. Now I know there is such complexity about people who live in this space and call this home and have deep roots here. And so I think my decision to write the book with Palestine in mind was in part because when I was there, so many of the custodians of these various sites are Palestinian Christians. And you recognize how deeply they cherish these stories, right? It's part of their faith and their family and I don't know, it felt to me like, how could I, having seen Jewish suffering in the Maccabean period and beyond, having now opened my eyes to see that Palestinians existed and to start paying attention to their stories in more modern times, how could I not write about God's arrival to this place without naming the people that are there? Some of them, like I said back in the text, some of them more modern, but all with this deep connection to make sure that we see those who have been unseen to us, in the hopes that by seeing them and sharing their stories, that we will maybe care about justice for them. We all know about what happened to the Jews in Germany and, the Eastern Europe. Not so many people know about the stories of the Nakba, what has happened since 1948, when a lot of our Palestinian brothers and sisters were pushed out of their homes to make space for the traumatized Jewish people who survived the Holocaust, right? So there's this deep intertwining. And so here we have two peoples with deep, again, here we are, trauma.
Yeah.
What happened for that for the Jewish community? Deeply traumatic. What happened for the Palestinian community? Deeply traumatic. And so you have these two communities, and there are others, but let's say predominantly these two groups of people with deep trauma trying to figure out how to live in this space together, and it is hard. But I wanted to write in such a way that we saw them both in the hopes that when we hope and pray for peace and work for peace, we are embracing both those communities.
Well, and this is kind of difficult to explain from a Western evangelical point of view, because I don't want to diminish anybody's importance within that area.
Right. But
Western evangelical church, specifically American, as we become pro-Jerusalem, pro-Israel, we have completely covered the idea of these Palestinians. So we have to look at them as all Muslim, as all, and this is in quotes for people who aren't watching this on video because there's no video, but that they're all terrorists, right? Regardless of, as we literally push people out of their homes to make space for Israel, we are pushing out Palestinian Christians. We are killing Palestinian Christians in the name of recovering the homeland for Jerusalem and Israel. And again, it's problematic because I don't want to belittle the Muslims that are there, right? You don't want to say they don't matter, and because they absolutely do. They absolutely matter. But we have, specifically within the Western mindset, we just live in a world where they're all Muslim. And that gives us the right to push them out of the way.
Well, at the very least, they're all Arab, in which case we can then push them all into the same category, right? But in an effort to sort of heal the Jewish diaspora, we've foisted a new one upon the Palestinians, haven't we? As they get ejected out of their homeland and scattered across the world. And their cultures are forever altered and changed, and sometimes in unrecoverable ways. That's the part that I want, I would love to see us contend with a little bit more honestly and say, listen, all right, what has been done? I mean, obviously the Jewish diaspora began, it predates the Holocaust. I mean, it's been going on, right?
Yeah, after the exile in Babylon, really, we start seeing the diaspora start to happen.
Right. And then, and we just see that sort of continuing on. One of the things that I don't think it's unique to any one people group. I think it's uniquely human, is that oftentimes when we are given the chance, when the roles may be reversed, rather than be extenders of peace, we decide that we'll just perpetrate the same things in other people. We see this all the time. And that's one of those things I see that happening with, even when you talk about Jubilee texts, where you say there are two kinds of people. It seems like there are those who went through this, and by God, I'm going to make sure nobody else has to. And then there's the flip side of that, where there are lots of other people who are like, man, I went through this. I paid my dues. You should have to as well. Why should I paid my debt? Why do you get any kind of Jubilee? So there's one, to me, is a gospel mindset. One is the liberation mindset that says, by God, I suffered, but that doesn't mean everyone has to. And to the extent that the gospel is good news, it should be good news for everyone. So I love that you write this story from that perspective, because I think that's in the best tradition of Scripture. That's one of the things that I think differentiates Scripture from other kinds of writings, is oftentimes we are given the point of view of the marginalized. And we are seeing the story from the perspective of those who generally are not heard from. So I love that you write from their perspective. I think that's a great move for what.
But it is, when you have two. In one sense, I wondered, have I bit off more than I can chew? to include the people and the place and politics of Palestine into the fabric of this book. But I still think it's worth. it's worth our attempt to name these things, to name the trauma communities. As a liberation theologian, I still think we have to name where the current imbalance in terms of justice and oppression, where it is. And that's hard, but I think we do. My friends who live in the West Bank are absolutely living under oppression, and we have to name that. That has to be part of peace has to be able to say the oppression has to stop, even as we recognize that we're dealing with pain on both sides of the checkpoint. But it's hard, and yet I think this is what we're invited into when we think about God's peace and how different it is from Caesar's. And of course, this is the Advent narratives are just the beginning, right? They don't end very hopefully. Matthew in particular starts off with, Joseph has a dream. In short order, there's a baby. And then there's, they fly across the border as political refugees to Egypt. Herod had slaughters, not just in Bethlehem, but throughout the region. There's a slaughter looking for Jesus. Anybody who could usurp the throne from Herod. And then when the Holy Family gets to come back, it's too hot for them to go back to Bethlehem. There's still a target on their back. And so they go up to Nazareth. Basically, they become internally displaced. Not that Galilee was a safe place either. It was also a hotbed of resistance, et cetera. And so, from Matthew's perspective, Jesus was born, but then atrocities kept coming. And I think we don't often grapple with that in our Advent stories. We want to end with the manger and the star and this harmonized picture that never really existed in the texts. And Matthew leaves us in a much more dark place in terms of the reality of, like I said, the complexity of hope, the ways in which we really have to struggle with these things. And of course, we'll look at the whole trajectory of the life of Jesus to start to see what hope is going to look like as it plays out. But man, these Advent texts, I think, should really trouble us and challenge us.
Yeah, but that's something that we don't like, right? We don't like discomfort. Certainly not inside of the church. We don't like it, and especially at that time. So it might be a good idea. I may do this in my own little church, and maybe we'll talk about Advent in some other time, so we can go, hey, I don't want to wreck your Christmas, but there's stuff going on here that we actually have to talk about. There's some things in here that are deep, and deserve to be acknowledged.
Exactly. And working through this text for 2 years, it was wonderful to work through it, not during the holiday season.
Yeah.
And I have recommended to a few of my friends, if you could read this, if you would be willing to read this book, not during Advent, because I think it lands differently. Then we really look at what the gospel writers were saying, which is when God comes to these hemorrhaging terrains, to these troubled times, what are the challenges on the ground? And that's not a holiday story. That's anywhere you look in the world story. And so, yes, I would love it if you, took on that challenge and that was something that these texts were explored at a different time to kind of unlock that connection with the magical, glowing Christmas and to really say, what does it look like when God comes to this land?
Yeah.
For me, it was transformative. So I would wish that for others.
Yeah. The story is compelling anyway. But you're right. I think it can get overshadowed by the trappings of the season. And so then it's kind of like Easter as well, so all of the trappings of the season you begin to overshadow some of the brutality and some of the stuff that is more complex that happens there. I'm still looking at the reviews on your page here, and I don't want to let us miss out on the fact that Walter Brueggemann has written you an amazing endorsement for this book, who's one of my favorite. And that's where I got the crossing thing, John, was because Brian McLaren actually, he intones. He brings that up in his review. He says that you write with the textual insight of Walter Brueggemann, the historical understanding of Borg and Crossan. You got the Borg and the Crossan. Oh my gosh.
Brian is very generous.
Very generous. He's living up to that. My favorite book of his probably the first book of his I read was called The Generous Orthodoxy.
Yes,
and generosity is one of the hallmarks of Brian McLaren. We've had the pleasure of having him on the podcast too. And he's just a genuinely generous guy. But wow, if you need a reason beyond the fact that John and I are telling you this is amazing, some heavy hitters have weighed in on this book and said that it's a necessary read. It's something that we needed to have. And so for that, I'm intrigued as all heck. John and I have the book in our possession. We got it a little bit too late to review for this interview, so we've come at this from a complete. We just haven't had the opportunity. My book is sitting on my nightstand at home. My wife sent me a picture and said, "You got a book?" And so as soon as I get home, I'm going to be like, "Woo!" Grab that book and.
Well, I can add that. So I've read 2 chapters of the book, and
man, I'm impressed. You're a fast reader.
I'm not going to say it's an easy read because you have to sit down and you have to pay attention to what you're reading. But it reads, it flows. You don't want to put it down. You really don't, because there's books where there's like very specific breaks where you're like, okay, I can take a break here. But I don't. The way you write, at least so far, what I've read is it flows so easily that I don't want to stop. I just want to keep reading. So I am looking forward to finish. As soon as we're done here, I'm gonna read more because I'm really enjoying the book.
You're coming into chapter 3. That's going to be a really interesting one.
Well, give us a teaser. What's chapter 3 gonna tell us about?
Chapter 3 is the chapter about the girl from Galilee, Mary.
Okay.
And understanding Mary from Galilee, again, there's a lot of freight when you say that she's from that region. It was a restive region, always something going on in the Galilee, whether it was an active military campaign, a rebellion, and people pushing back, protests. I mean, there was always things going on in the Galilee. And so if you remember Ahead to Mimi, who was for this young 16-year-old girl in the news a handful of years ago for slapping an Israeli soldier.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I think that Mary actually is... Ahead to Mimi reminds me of what Mary might have been like. Formed in that region, formed in that space where you are resisting an occupying force. Every day is a battle. It shapes you, and I would imagine it shaped Mary. And so not meek and mild, but actually somebody who had some fight in her.
Yeah.
Her fight came out in her songs, right? It came out in her, but I think that came from a certain place that shaped her. And I mean, there's some other things I think her story, that region was also known for a lot of brutality, etc. But you'll have to read that part.
Yeah.
But it changed my sense of Mary, and it made me hear her song differently.
And I think it's important, like Nat was saying, maybe to come at the Advent not during Christmas time, because then you can acknowledge the suffering, the oppression, being part of a marginalized group, right? Which we think of Jesus as the head of this Christian behemoth that has become, right? And that we are the ones in power. Jesus, as a Jew under Roman Empire, was not in power. He was part of a marginalized, brutalized group of people.
And as a Galilean, he was even further down, because those who came from Judea, from the Jerusalem set, would have seen the Galileans as bad Jews.
Yeah.
Right. He was even he was even further down.
Yeah. So he was like backwater, hillbilly, kind of wrong side of the tracks. And Mary's like Jenny from the block, right? She's like Mary from the gal. All right. Yeah. I coined a new phrase, John.
You did. Wow.
All right. John, write a song about that. Mary from the gal. Oh,
okay. I'll work on that.
Maybe don't do that. That's but I like that though, because I do think that so much of, if nothing else, Kelley, so many of our images have just become stale just through repetition. And if nothing else, I think we just need to upset those things and start seeing people less like I think we have a tendency to see people like Mary as 2-dimensional characters who serve a purpose, right? She's there to move she's a plot device to move the story along versus a fully realized human being.
It's something as simple as we just want to ignore that if it wasn't for Mary, that the first miracle that Jesus does doesn't happen, right? If it wasn't for Mary saying, well, do it anyway, basically, He's like, it's not my time. It's not my time. And I was like, yeah, but you're going to do it.
Yeah, but I'm your mom, so get it done.
Yeah. So, I mean, that speaks volumes to this woman that we've kind of marginalized and pushed to the side as like a not even like a main character in this Advent story.
Well, and inside the Catholic Church, she takes on a whole other persona, right? So how does your take on Mary, does that jive with Catholic Orthodoxy? Or is there room in there for some movement on her?
I think I really came at her from more of a historical, it was really the research on what was happening on the ground in Galilee, what likely she would have been exposed to with soldiers and traumatized neighbors, et cetera, around her. There would have been some things that women would have been exposed. We know from Josephus and others, women were exposed to. And I think seeing what was going on in the region helped me see that there were some other things that Mary most likely was exposed to. And there was a Catholic feminist theologian that wrote a book that was part of my kind of engaging an alternative reading about Mary. But she was not loved for her book.
Right.
So the Catholic, for a long time, they didn't want to embrace Gustavo Gutierrez. And I think they didn't want to embrace Jane Schomburg either because her reading was revolutionary. But I actually think there's some deep merit to it, especially when you combine her thinking and scholarship with what was happening in the Galilee. And, Mary probably, experienced some things we in polite company don't like to talk about.
Yeah, I would imagine.
But it makes her song all the more amazing because when she talks about those who have been humiliated being lifted up, she most likely is talking in real time about herself. I myself have been humiliated in ways that, as I said, we don't often want to say in polite company. But it echoes a passage in Deuteronomy where I myself have been humiliated and I have been lifted up. And so, yes, is it a prophetic song that she sings? Sure. But I actually think that what gets me excited is the realization that she was probably singing about what was happening to her in real time, that she was the first fruit of a God who would reverse her story. And that incarnation at the place of her deepest pain is where God, incarnation happened. Again, that pain was not something that scared God, but that God entered deeply into the most grievous, painful parts of our human story. That is part of what is in the body of God now. And I think Mary is the first fruit of that. And she says there'll be others. But I think she was singing first and foremost about her own story. Yeah,
I think you're right. I mean, my understanding of the prophetic anyway is exactly what you just described. I do believe that those prophetic utterances come from real time experiences as well as speaking about what might come to pass. But those I don't know, that's amazing. The possibilities there then are endless, I think. And one of the things I do appreciate about the Catholic Church, I'm not Catholic myself, and I was raised decidedly anti-Catholic because that's just the way it was in the churches we were raised. We weren't even sure that y'all were saved. I mean, we're pretty sure. I sent missionaries to predominantly Catholic countries when 90% of the population was Christian. But they weren't the right kinds of Christians. And so we sent missionaries to South America, because they had to evangelize the heathen papists. I mean, it boggles the mind. But one of the things I do appreciate about Catholicism, one thing that I think if you're not inside of that stream, it's easy to conceive of Catholicism as monolithic, and it's just not. I mean, there are the most diverse streams of people you can think of, from the most ultra progressive and liberal to obviously the most fundamentalist and conservative. Yes. So everything in between. As I was sort of investigating my own faith more, and I started being turned on to writers and authors, and I kept being shocked how many of them were Catholic.
Yes.
I was like, oh, well, gosh, I guess I have to read Richard Rohr now. Okay, well, I guess I have to. I'm going back to to Thomas Merton, and I'm reading people like Capon who were Episcopal, and I'm reading people way outside of my tradition, and I begin to appreciate, even within one stream of Christianity, the complexity of that. So.
Yes. The same is true for Islam, which again, a lot of people realize it's not one thing. They have their own sects and denominations and various reading. Like the whole gamut that we see in our, in Christianity. When you talk to, my Islamic friends, same thing. They have, all different varieties, and yet we want to paint everybody with one, easy stroke, so we can more.
I have a good friend that I work with, and she's Muslim, and she said, "Well, I'm Sufi." I'm like, I don't even know what that means because that's not in my lexicon, right? That's not in my knowledge. I just paint a very broad brush of everyone's Muslim, so they are all the same. And so she's like, "Well, look it up."
Yeah.
Well, I'm like, okay. Okay.
But there are people inside of that tradition. Even I'm thinking of a guy that I'm familiar with on Facebook named Safi Kaskas, who is a great mediator. One who wants to, he's very much a peace theologian inside of his own tradition, very much sees Islam as a religion of peace, and also fully affirms and embraces and loves his Christian and Jewish brothers and sisters. And so to paint everybody inside of that faith in the same brush is just the biggest of travesties. I mean, it's just not even remotely fair. So I love that. I love that your book comes at that, even embracing that part of the world and trying to see things through their experience and through their eyes. I think that's amazing. So I cannot wait to dive deeper. If you, we're going to have to, I think, come to a close here. We could talk all day, Kelley. My goodness. Utterly fascinating. I'm not blowing smoke. Yeah. I mean, I'm still just sort of riveted by everything you've talked about. I think it's amazing. But I want to leave enough meat on the bone that people want to go buy your book. So go buy the book, man. Support people like Kelley who are doing the work and who are putting in the time. We'll link to all of your stuff in the show notes. Make sure that they have access to all of your other things as well. Yeah. John, you have any parting wisdom before we say goodbye?
No, my tank is empty.
I thought all you're going to do is shake your head for the people at home who can't see you. They're like, "John, you got anything?" He's just shaking his head. Okay.
He's going to read chapter 3.
He is.
Yeah.
He likes to show up. Yeah, he fails to mention he's on vacation right now, so he's got time. Although he spent most of yesterday splitting wood, I think, which sounds like work to me. So
I'll be heading back out to do more.
All right.
Well, hey, Kelley, we appreciate you. Thank you for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
We'd love to check back with you at some point and see if we can see what else is going on in your world. But
maybe we can talk about Advent when it's not,
Yes.
We're not.
Let's do
it in the, I don't know, in the spring. Some that
I like to do, and like I said, I have a little church that I pastor, and we like to 2-3 times a year go through books together, and this is one that I'm going to recommend highly that we go through, and maybe I'll reach out to you and we can chat about it. And I think that would be a welcome little treat. So I appreciate that.
Oh, I believe that.
Cool. Well,
thank you guys too for reaching out.
Yeah,
of course, we appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.